Behind me now is Pinhook Draw, and from June 15th to 16th, 1881, a brutal battle was waged here, which claimed the lives of 10 cowboys and between 2 and 22 Ute. Now, to understand the revolution of 1881, you got to understand the failure of politics from 1868 in Colorado going forward. In 1868, half a dozen Ute tribes met with the governor to discuss where they were going to go, because with the settlement, it became clear they needed a reservation. And the governor said, you get the entire western third of the state because that's of no use to us. What would we have with the Rocky Mountains? But in the early 1870s, gold was discovered. So all of the influx of pioneers, explorers, and profiteers, they totally ignore the treaties that they'd signed with the Native Americans. And because of this, the Native Americans can't vote. So the settlers are now voting for politicians on a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Get those redskins out of here. That's what they would always vote for, every time. And the governor has an official campaign slogan of the Ute must go. And he appoints his buddy, Nathan Meeker, who has no experience in handling the Native Americans, in charge of the White River Ute Indian Agency. And because he has no experience but great disdain, he forbids them from hunting on the reservation, and he blocks food shipments. So they massacre him, they kill everybody that they can find who works for the Indian Agency, and there's a general uprising which is suppressed by troops from Wyoming who end up just mortaring the teepee of the leader. It's a brutal suppression of this revolt, but from this point forward, the governor decides to exile all of the Utes to a tiny strip of land near Four Corners. And even that land is now being infested with settlers who are searching for gold. And you can understand why Mancos Jim, Chief Polk, and Chief Posey decided to go out into Utah and kill the settlers that they could find. And on May 1st, 1881, 2 of these settlers were murdered, and the small war band decided to steal their weapons, kill their cows, and rustle their horses, and make their way south to Monticello, where they rendezvoused with another band of Ute who had also been exiled from Colorado. And now they kind of acknowledged that a war against the settlers was on. They wanted a general uprising, and there were very few settlers here, so they figured it might actually be possible. And so they move up to this canyon, and 36 posse men assemble to go look for them. But these posse men, they're all miners, they're all cowboys, they're all kind of rough and tumble outlaws, and none of them are military. They have no police or military experience. So they go find the camp of about 100 people, most of them warriors, and immediately about a dozen of the 36 people just hightail it back to Moab, knowing they won't be able to win. And the remainder of them wait until nightfall before firing down into the camp and sending most of the warriors scattering up to Pinhook Draw. And what's left behind are 1,500 horses and 8 women. Now, these cowboys figure they can just take the horses as the spoils of war, and they leave several of the posse behind to just watch over the women and the horses. But later that night, as the rest of the posse is moving up behind me to discover their camp here, the women sneak out the back of the tent and make off with all the horses, the posse's included. So the posse that's a couple miles south is forced to walk over to Moab. And as this is happening, the fight begins over here. Now they send 6 people to go scout out the camp and see what's what. Now these people are never heard from again. It's pretty obvious they were found by an Indian scout and killed, and their bodies were later found in the aftermath of the battle. And on the 15th, they decide to finally charge, but they're immediately overpowered and they retreat back to the springs. And they wait for nightfall again and they try to make another charge, and in total, about 10 of the cowboys die at Pinhook Draw, and the Native Americans scatter up the canyons, down the Colorado River, and back into Colorado. Now of those, only 2 were ever caught and tried, apart from the ringleaders, because it was Mancos Jim, Polk and Posey. Only 2 were tried in Colorado, and on their way to Colorado, the posse kind of meets a Buffalo Soldier regiment of about 200 people, and they go try to talk to the captain, and the captain says, "You did what? Well, like, why are you getting involved with the Indian Wars if you're just civilians? You could start an entire war." Up until this point, they viewed it as cattle rustling, but it had become a war. And he threatened to put all of them in jail. He said, you've destroyed everything we've worked for here in Utah, and he threatened to put them in jail. So for a while, there was a armed standoff between the cowboys and the Buffalo Soldiers, 200 of them. But eventually this kind of fizzled down, and the Native Americans made it back to Colorado, and in 1923, the last of the Indian Wars would be waged. So in the early 1920s, Polk and Posey were both involved with conflicts down in Bluff and Blanding. And it's fascinating to think that the last Indian War saw the use of planes and Model Ts out in the canyons of Four Corners.